consideration, I placed ethical considerations over observational data, that is going to frame my research, right? So that I'm going to make sure that I take these ethical considerations into account prior to, and it takes precedence over the thing that I'm actually interested in. However, this evil maniacal researcher places observational data over ethical consideration. Well, I'm going to do whatever it is that I need to do in order to get that information, right? Which means that if I need to mislead my participant, if I need to coerce my participant, if I need to force my participant, if I need to disrespect my participant, whatever it is that I need to do in order to get the story, the narrative from the participant, I'm going to do that. You can see then that this is going to be huge problems in the assessment. Now, to give you just one, I don't do history at all, and I don't like talking about contemporary scholars because it is problematic, because they're alive, I'm alive, and I'm not doing anything to try and sort of debase other scholars. I have respect for my colleagues. This is just an example, and it's not an example that I made up. It's a very well-known sort of historical example. I'm not saying that the example is one of ethical misconduct, but I'm giving you an idea. So, researcher, I'm not going to put the name out there, but researcher comes up with the idea, the concept known as eliminationist anti-Semitism. So the technical phrase is eliminationist anti-Semitism, and the researcher puts forth this concept. And it's a pretty provocative concept, and without getting into the whole historical bit, the idea is, generally speaking, that eliminationist anti-Semitism was a prevailing belief, a prevailing, if you will, ideology within Germany and throughout the German community, that Germans basically as such didn't like Jews. Now, I'm generalizing, but that's the general framework with which the research was guided. So goes the historical debate. Other scholars have said that, listen, it's not fair, obviously, to generalize across a population of people. You can't make the claim that it's the case that all or most of members of this population had this particular eliminationist anti-Semitic belief, because there are infinitely many examples of which Germans helped Jews escape, and so on and so on and so on. Now, not to say that the consideration wasn't taken into part, right? It's not that. But you can see that the observational data is that, listen, Germans participated in the systematic extermination of the Jewish population. If you make your research, right, and I'm not saying that this is a top-notch researcher, but the argument, and this is a historical argument between camps, it's not my argument, this is just an example, but I don't want to put the names out there. Those of you who are so inclined, you can Google eliminationist anti-Semitism and sort of, figure this out on your own. But the idea is, if the observational data says that Germans obviously participated in the extermination of Jews, and you use that as the focal point for your research, the fact that that happened as the focal point of your research, your interest is that, and then you create a narrative in which, because of this factual account, I'm going to make a generalization across a community of people. Well, there are ethical problems with that, right? There are huge ethical implications in that generalization. So the point is that in processing either qualitative data or historical information, we need to deliberate about our generalizations. We need to deliberate about our methodological approach. We need to consciously deliberate about the implications of our research, because if our research tends to demonize and generalize across a population, then you can immediately recognize that there's going to be a huge negative backlash against that research, right? There's going to be a backlash against that research, and then ultimately against the researcher, him or herself. So in order to circumvent the pitfalls that researchers, and not maliciously, right, but in order to circumvent the pitfalls that researchers fall into in making generalizations, in not conducting the research in accordance with ethical regulations and considerations, IRB, blah, 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 what you want to do is take into serious account deliberation in your research process, right? So deliberation, ethical deliberation, moral deliberation will give us the ability to conceptualize errors, generalizations, suppositions in our own reasoning, and you can't do this enough. Later in the video series, I'll talk about reassessing and reassessment. But you should always be reassessing your assumptions. You should always be reassessing the things that are guiding your research, right? The generalizations that you might otherwise overlook. Okay, so enough of that. The next, number 2, is choice. I'm not going to go into a huge account of choice because I tend to differ, and I sort of, as a philosopher, step outside of the traditional discourse among qualitative researchers. And my interpretation of choice is so nuanced that it conflicts sort of inherently with typical sort of traditional assumptions of choice, right? Choice, the traditional idea of choice is that here I am, researcher, and I have a choice between X and Y, right? So insofar as we're talking about ethical considerations, then I need to assess, is X a better choice than Y? Is Y a better choice than X? But there are tons and tons of sort of systemic, semantic problems with this generalization. I don't want to get into that now because it'll take me down a very dark philosophical pathway. So just conceptualize choice however you like to conceptualize choice, right? Insofar as I am a qualitative methods researcher, I have to make sure in factoring ethical considerations into my research that I choose between the better options. As far as what better is, as far as what better quality is, that's between you and your community members to make the assessment. If you're an independent researcher, then you need to make that internal assessment on your own. But you will need to justify and legitimize your choice, right? That point I do want to bring up. That insofar as you've made a choice, I think Y is better than X, then if problems arise and people say, well, why would you choose Y? Did you deliberate enough? You need to be able to justify your choice based on either the canon, previous research, the fact that you've conformed to some series of standards that regulates conduct in this arena, what have you, right? So don't think that choice is some sort of a blind option. There really needs to be a systematic recognition that your choice will need justification in the end, right? Your methodological process, especially if you're doing this for like dissertation preparation, your methodology justifies, right? The whole point is that your methodology, this is a very interesting, very important point, right? Especially for newbie researchers. Your methodology, the whole point of your methodology is to justify your research question, right? And your interview questions is the way in which you go about that justification, right? So your methodology, the whole point of your methodology section in your dissertation is to justify and legitimize, in association with, obviously, the lit review, your fundamental research question, that thing which is guiding your research. All of which needs to be framed within ethical considerations. So hopefully that's sort of blaringly clear. And also I apologize if I went a little too quickly, too deep, too fast. Usually I go a little bit slower, but you know, we're an hour plus into the series now, so hopefully you're getting accustomed to my teaching style. Lastly, accountability. Accountability is really complicated, right? And there is no right way to discuss accountability. As a philosopher, accountability is inherently associated with knowledge. So that, to be technical, there's a frame in philosophy known as epistemology. And it's basically the study of knowledge, STU, study of knowledge. Right? So epistemology is roughly the study of knowledge. You can't really talk about accountability outside of an epistemological framework. It's technical, what I just said. But basically all that means is, if you talk about accountability, then you're talking about the researcher's relationship to knowledge, right? Anytime we're talking about relationships to knowledge, the framework that governs that discourse is called epistemology. So that accountability is one aspect of many aspects of epistemological discourse. So that anytime you evoke or discuss accountability,